Ethical Perspectives on the News is produced by the Interreligious Council of Linn County, which is solely responsible for its content. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of the staff and management of KCRG TV9.
Well, thank you for joining us. I'm Peggy Stover, and this evening we are going to be discussing a very interesting topic, pharmaceutical advertising, the pros and cons to consumers and medical providers. And with me, I have two guests, and I will let them introduce themselves. Thank you so much for joining us.
Good evening, Peggy. Thank you.
Yeah, so tell us a little bit about yourself before I kick the project or the show off.
Well, my name is Chris Parker. I'm a clinical pharmacist. I graduated from the University of Iowa in 2006. I've worked primarily in the chronic disease field with family medicine clinics across not only the state of Iowa, but the United States as a whole. So a lot of experience over close to the last 2 decades in the area of chronic disease management.
Okay, well, thank you. And Shar?
Good evening. I am Shar Jones, and I am a former pharmaceutical sales representative. I was in the industry for about 8 years, promoting products for various disease states, and I'm just happy to be a part of the discussion tonight.
Well, thank you. And thank you again for joining us. So we are going to be discussing pharmaceutical advertising, the pros and cons to consumer. And just to give a little bit of background to our viewers about this topic, pharmaceutical advertising in the 1980s, the laws changed by then under then President Ronald Reagan, and it really altered the landscape in terms of advertising, specifically direct-to-consumer advertising by pharmaceutical companies. The United States is one of 2 countries on the globe that allows direct-to-consumer advertising. The other country being New Zealand, who highly regulates the type of advertising that can be done. So one of the things that I wanted just to discuss with you is, from your viewpoint, how has this changed in the law? From your perspective, how has it impacted your respective industries?
Sure.
So I'll go ahead and jump right in. As a former pharmaceutical sales rep, the pharmaceutical industry definitely benefits from this change in that it allows pharmaceutical companies to do direct-to-consumer advertising, thus allowing consumers to gain education on disease state, new pharmaceuticals that are coming to the market, thus prompting them to probably want to have conversations with their medical provider regarding those new drugs that are coming out. So definitely it allows pharmaceutical companies to do more research and development as they have a captive audience with the direct-to-consumer advertising. So I think it's been very beneficial for the industry.
Okay. And Chris, from your perspective, how has it impacted your respective industry?
Well, as a healthcare clinician, I think the pivot that we had to make as practitioners was be prepared to answer those questions that patients came to us with. Patients were had more access at their fingertips to information about medications that may affect their chronic conditions or other conditions that they may be having. So as healthcare providers, we needed to be prepared to have those discussions around what they were seeing. And then the challenge for us at times was explaining to patients, in the instance that a particular product wasn't appropriate for them and what that reason may be, was then our responsibility to educate them about how to effectively use those medications and is it appropriate for them or why it may not be appropriate for them. And then what other options were out there that may be better suited for them given their particular circumstances.
Okay. And one of the things in terms of, from a medical provider standpoint, in researching this particular topic, it really struck me as interesting is that the American Medical Association has come out publicly against direct-to-consumer advertising for several reasons. One of them being what they call, or what I'm going to paraphrase and coin, is what is known as false symptoms syndrome, which is, in other words, a consumer might come into a doctor's office because they saw a particular ad and then all of a sudden realize, gosh, I'm kind of exhibiting the same symptoms. Okay. Another reason is from a medical provider standpoint, consumers might be asking for a brand name drug instead of possibly a generic alternative that could be less costly. So what are your thoughts on those particular situations? And also, taking a look at the American Medical Association, their stand on the entire issue.
Yeah, and I'll address that from a clinician perspective. Okay. The challenge that we have with trying to mitigate some of the information that patients are receiving is that a lot of times that information, as you mentioned, is not applicable to the patient, or the symptoms that they say that they are experiencing maybe don't coincide with the particular conditions that medication is meant to treat. And so patients will want sometimes the best, the greatest, the fanciest, the shiniest new object. And when you tell them, well, that medication is not appropriate for you because of these situations or these circumstances, then sometimes they'll get upset at us as healthcare clinicians. And that's why the American Medical Association and other associations have come out and said that this direct-to-consumer advertising can not only put undue burden on the healthcare providers trying to address these situations, but there are also more cost-effective options out there that are just as, if not more effective than some of these new medications. And I think that's something that's important to remember, is that just because a new medication has been approved and is out there being marketed, it doesn't mean that it's better than what's currently available. And I think that's the challenge that we have as healthcare clinicians, is to educate patients as to why maybe the lower cost generic that they've been on for many years is as effective, if not more effective, than what they're asking to be prescribed, being based on what they've seen from the marketing perspective.
Okay.
Definitely. And just to add to the conversation, totally support what you're saying. And oftentimes, there is so much focus on the glamour side of the advertising that, a lot of times from the consumer standpoint, not really thinking about the side effects that go with the drug, because that is kind of a very small portion of the advertisement. But more than that, it is the cost issue and formulary. These ads are great. It's great making consumers aware, but ultimately, even if the provider chooses to prescribe, if they think that is the best treatment option, insurance, is it going to be on formulary? So once again, that becomes a challenge for the medical provider as well as that consumer that is, maybe advocating based upon what they saw in the ad.
Okay. And Shar, given that in your background as the former rep in the industry, some consumers may be thinking, gosh, the pharmaceutical industry on average, has been spending, according to estimates, about $10 billion annually in advertising. Shouldn't that money be used, instead of advertising, how about it goes back to keep prescription prices down or for further research? What are your thoughts?
Definitely. I can see both sides of it. Being in the industry, definitely need to keep costs down, because at some point we're all impacted. We may need a treatment that we're unable to afford. And so that does become a very real and personal issue. On the flip side of things, the direct-to-consumer advertising, that's the way for pharmaceutical companies to continue investing time, energy, and resources into bringing, additional medications to the market. So I can totally see both sides of it, but definitely the cost factor for consumers is a major concern.
Yeah, and I guess I would add to that, it's important for healthcare providers and patients as well to understand that the primary objective of the pharmaceutical companies is to make money for their investors. And so when you talk about advertising to generate sales and increase sales, the end consumer is not the patient. The end consumer is the investors. The end consumer is those of us who have 401ks or retirement accounts that happen to have some of those stocks in them. And so while I understand the benefit of trying to get information out to the patients, trying to get information out to the providers, the end goal is to not benefit the patient. And I'm not saying they don't benefit the patient, because many of those medications are very good, but the end goal is to make money. And I think that's the challenge we have with the current way that the system is set up, is that with no regulations, and my understanding, if I recall correctly, is that a lot of this falls under freedom of speech, under constitutional right for freedom of speech. Well, without putting some parameters around what is being presented, the way that it's marketed, the picnics, the dogs wagging their tail, going through the side effects at the very end, with everybody having a party, it gives a psychological, potentially misinterpretation of what's really occurring with some of these medications. And then we get to the cost of it. No one ever talks about the actual cost of the medication. We refer to it in terms of copays. Well, copays aren't consistent across the board. There's tens of thousands of different insurance plans. And so to say that what will be this copay or that is irrelevant, because they're basing that on the high percentage insurance plans. And so if we could talk about it in terms of actual dollars cost, that'd be a more level playing field. And for instance, what New Zealand does is to require you to talk about what is the actual cost of that medication. Okay, well, it's $1,300 a month for my insulin injection. Well, patients need to be aware of that. Physicians need to be aware of that. Pharmacists need to be aware of that. How do we help mitigate that cost to the patient without having all that relevant information?
And you brought up an interesting point. Do you think that advertising for these pharmaceutical drugs and also medical devices should feature their prices?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I think it should be mandatory that prices are made aware, because a lot of, even at the copay level, a lot of us have deductibles, or a lot of us have out-of-pocket maximums, or in the case of the Medicare plans out there, a lot of patients are capped in where they get hit at the donut hole. And so when they spend that first $2,000 to $3,000, then they have full out-of-pocket expense. And making patients aware of what that is so critical, and not just the patients, because as clinicians, we're the ones recommending it or trying to determine if it's appropriate. But even the best medication at the highest cost is irrelevant if a patient can't afford it or we can't find access to them. So in some situations, as healthcare providers, we're set up to fail when we see that information come through, and then a patient's honest about, well, I really want that. I understand you want that, but at $2,000 a month, it may not be the best for you, and it may not even be any better than what you currently have available. And so that's the delicate balance that we have as healthcare providers, is to try to educate patients about that, and then to try to figure out. I spend a lot of my day trying to understand what the coverage is at the insurance level. And I found tools to help me do that, but a lot of time spent on the phone with insurance providers to figure out, with this particular patient at this particular plan, what's it going to cost them in the coming year? I mean, that's a lot of time spent, where if I had that information up front, it'd be a lot more easy to manage and navigate that interaction.
And Shar, from your standpoint, from the pharmaceutical industry, what are your thoughts on having pricing just made up front in the advertising?
It would be nice, for the consumers, for providers as well. But I don't know if that is something that is going to happen down the road, because there's just so much involved in that conversation. But I do agree that it would be beneficial for consumers to know upfront, here's the cost, here's what to expect, because it is shattering when you really need a medication and you can't afford it. So it is time to have some real talk around, a very touchy subject that's impacting so many people.
Yeah, one of the things that also struck me as from a market, because my background as a professional marketer, that struck me as interesting in researching this, is that the FDA does not review advertising or the ads before they're aired. They only regulate the ads after they have been distributed, which meaning, it can lead to some false or misleading information that could reach consumers out there. Do you think that the FDA should have a bigger role in taking a look at these ads beforehand just to prevent misinformation from getting out there?
I can see how that would be beneficial because a lot of times, when you're watching these direct to consumer advertisements, the side effects are included at the very end. And truthfully, we really don't know the long-term implications and all of the side effects because the drug is usually new to the market. And so it would be nice if some of that, if we knew more of that, but then again, it's going to take longer for the consumer to actually then be able to utilize the medications.
Yeah, and Peggy, I would add to that. I think it even goes further than the FDA regulating the content, which is important, but and then ultimately the clinicians, they don't have access to all the data from the research studies that have been done. Right. Having spent years evaluating medical literature to identify best practices for managing conditions, one of the challenges with a lot of pharmaceutical company run research projects is that they only present data and results that is then given to peer reviewers to evaluate to determine whether or not that should be published. They don't make available all the data unless it's in some cases where it goes to court and litigation is involved. And so even at the ability for the FDA to evaluate what's being said in those advertisements, that's not the whole story. And I think that's where the challenge and one of my concerns is that the information we're given as clinicians to try to make, in some cases, life-threatening decisions one way or the other for a patient, we don't have all the information. That information is not made available to us from the companies, the pharmaceutical companies doing the research. And that's the real challenge. And then you take it to the next step of, it's not necessarily just misinformation, but it's omission of information when it comes to the advertising.
So what would it take to give you and other medical providers that information that you critically need to be able to make better decisions for people?
Yeah, so a lot of nationally and federally funded research requires the researchers, because I also participate in research, requires the research to share all of their data set as part of the federal funding that they're given. So that's mandatory. I would make it mandatory for any medically related research being done for healthcare in this case, that all of that data is made open source and available to anybody who wants to evaluate. And you should not be able to hold it back because a lot of times that data is manipulated to give an outcome that's preferred. And there's many instances where cases have gone to court and drugs have been pulled off the market because data originally given was incorrect or it was manipulated. So if that was made open source and mandatory for FDA approval, if you want a drug to be reviewed and FDA approved, you must mandatorily make that available open source, all the data that you gather. And I think that would help alleviate some of those constraints.
And Shar, do you think this is a possibility for the pharmaceutical industry to have that data, to Chris's point, be open source?
I think it would be great. I'm hopeful, but being removed from the industry, it's hard to know if they'll go in that direction or not.
Okay. So to make these changes, do you think it's more up to the FDA to implement these changes, or is it going to take the U.S. House, the Congress to come together to enact the change?
Yeah, it's going to have to come at the legislative level, Peggy. The FDA is only one small part of that, and they're only looking primarily at the effectiveness of a medication to allow it to be brought to market. So this has to come from higher up and be done at the legislative level. And I would even suggest that those of us on the front lines, myself included, should really be challenged to be more politically active in one form or another to make this well known to not only our local, state, and national representatives to understand the importance of this. So I do think it has to go higher all the way up to the legislative level.
Yeah, and that brings up another interesting point, because one of the things, this is a midterm year election, and there's been a lot of talk about putting, price caps on certain medication, and we need to overhaul the entire system. However, one of the issues that we're faced is the fact that, not to get too deep in the weeds here, but because a lot of people in Congress do accept PAC money from the pharmaceutical industry, it makes one wonder, where are consumers caught in this situation where you have consumers demanding change and individuals like yourself demanding change, and we need this data. But on the other hand, we're being, handcuffed to the reality that we have members of Congress, which, right or wrong, depending, however you feel, are accepting money for, for various reasons. So where can we start moving in things in the right direction to benefit consumers and the industry in a better manner for everyone to benefit?
That's a tough one. What you've presented, when I was in the industry, there was always conversations around, the pharmaceutical industry is supporting, various congressmen and women, etc. That it's tough.
Yeah.
Because how do you bring about real change if it's being supported from those that are advocating for us? So, yeah.
And I would add, Shar, to your point about we're not going to be able to completely overhaul this program the way it's set up, for sure, in my lifetime. But what we can do is put in place some restrictions around what is allowed and what is not. And so, again, starting with making data available, starting from putting more restrictions on the marketing that de-incentivizes pharmaceutical companies from potentially misinterpreting the data that they've given and then giving it to the end consumer in a way that makes it look more positive than it probably is. I think if you start there, the incentives decrease for some of that behavior. I'm not going to say it's going to go away, and I think that's unrealistic. But if you can de-incentivize some of those avenues, that's a great start in order to see some improvement. I mean, we could spend 30 minutes just on that legislative side. I know that's not our scope here, but that would allow some opportunity to see some incremental change going forward.
Okay. So at the end of the day, from your opinion, from your vantage point and opinion, both as professionals and also as consumers, do you think that this change in law that took place 30 plus years ago has benefited consumers and those providing care?
I would say it has benefited consumers because we are informed, we're aware, we're more knowledgeable about disease state. But on the flip side, as we become more educated about pharmaceuticals, the flip side is sometimes what's being presented to us is not within reach for us to be able to use these pharmaceuticals. And, the side effects, a lot of things are still unknown about some of the new pharmaceuticals that are coming to the market. So there's some pros and some cons as you look at this law.
Yeah, and I would add to that, I do think there is some level of benefit making information available to consumers. The challenge with that is the type of information that we're making accessible to them is oftentimes very difficult to decipher. I spent close to 8 years in education and received a doctorate to evaluate medications, dosages, therapeutic usages. And it's still difficult for me, depending on the literature that I'm reading, to determine what may or may not be beneficial. So I think it's a struggle for an average citizen to be able to look at something and say, yes, I think I've evaluated this in enough detail to determine that it's appropriate for me. And I don't know that most people have the capacity to do that.
And I would agree, because ultimately it really should be up to our medical providers to determine what is going to be the best treatment, based on our complete medical history and how we're presenting. We really need to leave that in the hands of the medical provider.
Yeah, and that's a great point, because one of the things that medical providers are mentioning is that this advertising and the change in law has created a somewhat of a conflict between providers and patients, because at the end of the day, the providers want to do what's best for the patients and not necessarily have the patients telling them and dictating them, hey, I saw this, I want this. Or even exploring other options such as lifestyle changes, diet changes, etc. So it is a very complicated issue with no easy answers, but it is, like I said, a very fascinating one. Again, given that the U.S. is one of 2 countries that does allow direct-to-consumer advertising of pharmaceuticals. Any other last comments you'd like to share with our viewers?
Well, I'll just add, from the healthcare perspective, it is important for patients and their healthcare providers to go through the shared decision-making approach to determine what's best for them, whether it is lifestyle, whether it is medication related. I encourage patients to be willing to engage in those kind of decisions and be proactive in being an advocate for themselves. And I encourage my peers and other healthcare providers to be open to have that kind of shared decision-making discussion to determine what is best. Yes, we may have more information from the medication and healthcare perspective, but it's important to get the perception of the patient and what their goals and outcomes are as well.
Definitely. And I would just add, I agree that as a consumer, as a patient, it is best to be informed. That is a good thing, to be knowledgeable and to advocate for ourselves. But most of all, to partner with our medical provider and trust that our medical provider is going to provide the best treatment for us. That's in our best interest.
Well, thank you so much for being with us here today on Ethical Perspectives. I would like to again thank Dr. Chris Parker and Shar Jones for being here with us. Thank you so much. This has been very, very informative. I am so glad and appreciative that you were able to take the time to meet with us and to share your viewpoints on this topic. So thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you, Peggy and Shar. It was nice meeting you.
Nice meeting you also. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you so much.